1999, Sky Gray, Ohio. Mom, the little girl said, lying in bed. Did anyone in our family ever do anything great? I mean, I know I'm cousin to the Grays around here, but did a Finch ever do anything? Barb Finch looked at her daughter Trish, the love of her life, a miracle of existence. Dark hair, hazel eyes, thin, smart as a whip, athletic. If Trish didn't have a book in her hand, it was because it's hard to hold a book while carrying a lacrosse stick or tennis racket. She always had a skinned knee or elbow, always a bruise here or there. She could be absent from home for whole mornings or afternoons. Sky Gray was a town of free-range parenting, of parents who wondered that there was any other kind. Most nights, Trish was tired. A name came to mind. She remembered seeing a picture of Billy Finch in his army uniform before he went to war and didn't return. Oh, I don't know if you'd call him famous or great, but your great-uncle is in some history books, she said. Billy Finch, on your dad's side of the family. Your great-grandpa's big brother. You remember great-grandpa Finch who died last year? What did he do? Trish asked. A relative in history books? Her mother looked at her. Billy? He fought in World War I, and he disappeared. He and his whole group. They call it the Lost Platoon. No one knows what happened to them. 40 or 50 guys, and he was their lieutenant. They probably all died. World War I. Trish asked, when was that? Barb hesitated. Long time ago, she said. Before Grandpa was your age. She didn't remember the years of World War I. Everybody who fought in that war has died now, I think. Or they'd be over 100, probably. She was mostly right about that. Uncle Billy? Trish asked, imagining daring do in that war that was not much of a stage for heroics. Her mother kissed her cheek. Nobody knows what happened. Maybe you'll figure it out, she said. Now sleep. Trish rolled over. She thought, Billy Finch and the Lost Platoon. 2008, Sky Gray, Ohio. The dance was a vestige of another time. A small group played dance songs from decades past. The mayor of Sky Gray said a few words, but its title was evocative, and for some time, it represented something to the rural people of the area. John Glenn attended too as a senator. Several governors from Ohio and Indiana came for the attention, even an ambassador from France once. The Vanished Warriors Ball was held every decade near the 4th of July, and for Sky Gray, it was quite a party. Several hundred attended every time, wearing the best they had. Tickets were expensive, although no one was ever turned away at the door. Most paid. After the bills were paid, any money went to a veterans charity. Tables were arranged on the carpet from the main entrance to the dance floor. There were chandeliers, it was brightly lit, and drinks were served. This year a small, live band played, a disabled former Marine lieutenant fronting the group. At 8, the memorial commenced. Good evening, the singer said, using crutches but smiling. I'm Josiah Langer, and I live in Sky Gray now. I was in the Marines, but I sing, so the Army guys put up with me. He nodded toward a table of soldiers also in uniform. People smiled and laughed politely. Langer then introduced the mayor of the town, who took the microphone to conduct a ceremony. Tricia Finch, about to begin her sophomore year at Ohio State, was manning the table at the door, taking tickets and collecting money, but she turned for the little ceremony she'd never seen. Her Aunt Sheila Gray spoke into the microphone. It's time we take our seats. Everyone, please, she asked gently, and the room became quiet. Thank you. Welcome to the 9th Vanished Warriors Ball. We have a small ceremony that goes back to 1928 and the first Vanished Warriors. We begin with the 4th verse of the Star-Spangled Banner, which at that time was not the national anthem, and the 4th was the verse sung before the Lost Platoon boarded the train to leave for World War I. Please rise. Langer stood forward and sang, to the accompaniment of his small group, the rarely heard 4th verse. The hall was not so large that he needed electronics, so for this song he did not use the amplifier. There was clapping then, and the mayor began. Thank you, Mr. Langer. It is our custom to sit for this ceremony, so please be seated. All sat and watched Mayor Gray. These words are read at every ball. Hear ye all present, she read loudly. It became quiet. There may have been 500 there. We gather to remember the men of the Lost Platoon, feared lost since June 23, 1918, men from Sky Gray and other parts of western Ohio and eastern Indiana, and one from Missouri. They are not forgotten, and we still await their return. If anyone here present awaits the return of a family member, please rise and remain standing when I read his name. One by one, she read the rank, full name, and hometown of each member of the lost platoon. As she did, various people stood at their seats for a relative unmet by them, lost 90 years earlier. She read on as more and more people stood, the great-great-nieces and nephews and distant cousins of boys killed at 19 so long ago. From lowest to highest rank, she read the names. At the mention of Sergeant Harvey Lancaster, the lone soldier from Missouri, a very, very old woman in a wheelchair was pushed forward a bit, onto the hard dance floor by a young woman of perhaps 25, who stood behind. The mayor saw those two and smiled, and finally said, "First Lieutenant William Finch, of Sky Gray, Ohio." And she saw Finches and Grays all over the room stand. "I add myself to that number," Sheila Gray said. Trish turned at her table. "You should stand too," Maddie Morrison said, her co-worker for the evening. "You're a Finch." None of them ever met him either. Trish stood at her table. "Ladies and gentlemen, the living relatives of the lost platoon," the mayor said, and began to applaud. She was joined by all in a gentle ovation. There were no direct descendants. None of the lost platoon had children. That fact impressed itself on Trish as she saw all those standing. Finally, the mayor read from her paper again, "Sky Gray Platoon. We await your return. This will always be your home." At this gathering, no mothers cried, no brothers wept, no sisters wailed. She handed the microphone to a minister, who gave a prayer for their souls or their safe return, which no one had considered possible for 50 years or more. The mayor said, "Thank you. You may be seated. There is someone who would like to speak." The mayor took the portable microphone and visited the Missouri women, and then called for quiet. "Ladies, gentlemen, your attention please." A spotlight pointed at the mayor and the two women. "I'm with Clara Lancaster Jones, the sister of Sergeant Harvey Lancaster of Missouri. She would like to say a few words about her brother." The mayor turned the microphone over to the very old woman. "I was 5 when Harvey was killed in 1918. I expect I am the oldest relative alive here, but I want you to know that they were real people. I remember Harvey in his uniform, our parents so proud." She hesitated at the thought. "I didn't know him well. He was 17 years older. Still, he was my brother. He didn't know where Sky Gray was. I remember him saying." She smiled. "I'm here with my great-granddaughter Evelyn. We think it's wonderful what you are doing here, and we hope you continue it. Perhaps someday, we'll find out what happened to them." She handed the microphone back to the mayor. Trish had never seen such a commemoration. It was a sober and lovely night. A U.S. senator stopped in. The lieutenant governor was there with his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The governor of Ohio sent his regrets. For a decade after the end of the Great War, mothers in western Ohio told their children about the local boys who went to Europe. They sent their sons over there, thanked the army they were together, and hoped for a best that was not to be. From Europe came a few letters immediately after landing, some more over the next few months, but the last notes just said they were soon to move up. Then there was nothing. No letter came, nothing for months. The army declared them missing. Eventually, they were presumed dead. Letters were sent to senators and congressmen, to the army, to the president, but no one knew anything. The army sent an officer to find them, but the war was still raging and he found no sign of anyone. One day, parents and relatives said to their surviving children, "God took them, and every one of them was carried to heaven by an angel." One second they were soldiers, and then they were saints. It was a great tragedy for the likes of Sky Gray, or Eaton, Ohio, or Lynn or Muncie, Indiana. A door slammed once in 1924, and Mrs. Finch looked up, thinking it must be Billy. Mrs. No saw her son Douglas in the 1930s at the New Union Terminal train station in Cincinnati from a distance as he got on a train, but he never turned around and then he was gone. She cried for hours, convinced he was alive and just didn't come home for some reason. Tom Canale saw his brother once walking along the street in Sky Gray in 1936. He ran up to him, pulled on his arm, but when he turned it wasn't him. Tom said, "Sorry, I thought you were someone else." Mother Lindstrom told her daughter, "Every time the steps creak I look up and think it might be Ted." finally home. Remember how he always bounced on those steps? That happened for decades. Finally, all who had hoped for their return were gone, too. They were just a legend. No old man wandered in 50 years later, claiming to be the long-lost Private Simpkins or Sergeant Lancaster. No Billy Finch, no Alan Scranton, no Doug no one. They stepped onto a troop transport train in early 1918, and no one from Sky Gray ever saw them again, alive or dead.
2010 Rochambeau, France.
The screen door creaked open, its spring twinging. "Mama, come quick, we found something." Little Sherry, almost 6, yelled from the back door, excited and smiling. Amy Duran took her hands out of the dishwater, dried them on a towel, and wondered what the children had gotten into. "Come on, Mama, come on," Sherry insisted, pulling on her hand. They went outside on that brilliant, cool spring Saturday. Sherry pulled on her mother's hand until they were jogging to the base of the ridge, where it merged with the floor of the valley. The ground was always a little moist there. Around the point of the spur it became a swamp pond. Gene was there, holding a small cylinder of metal, caked in mud and dirt. Seeing his mother approach, he held it out to her proudly. "Look, Mama, look what we found right here, just sticking out of the ground." Amy saw what he held and her heart stopped. She didn't want to frighten them, but she was frightened. "Gene, don't move." Her voice had a commanding tone neither of the children had ever heard. "Just hold it out and don't move." "Let me have it, please," she said, gently. "What is it, Mama? Why are you?" he said. Then he remembered all the times she or Uncle Jacques had warned them not to touch things they found on the ground. They had not said it for some time, so it hadn't mattered. Amy gently put her hands around the cylinder, which had 2 bands of iron or steel belted about the tube that looked to be brass. It was heavier than she expected. Gene pulled his hands back. "Good," she said, not moving. "Now listen to me. I want you to run to the house. Get your uncle. Hear me? Get your uncle." Gene and Sherry were scared. Now, their mother was scared, and they could feel her fear. Gene saw her perspiring, saw her trembling. "Go. Run," she said, standing there with her arms out, scared to pull her hands closer, or to accidentally shake or jostle the old bomb. They ran. Uncle Jacques should be in the house or the front field. Amy slowly squatted and gently, oh so gently, put the cylinder down on the ground. The children heard the explosion, and Sherry screamed. "Patricia Finch? Here. Trish, please. I'm interested in the impact of war on small communities." The professor made a notation. "Arlington Jeffries?" "Here," said a tall guy in the corner. "His hair is perfect," Trish thought. "He probably spent more on those clothes than I did on my car." "I'm studying the role of women in my life," Jeffries said. There was a groan from 2 of the 3 women in the room. Dr. Sims raised an eyebrow and smiled. "Sociology seminar is down the hall. Psychology is downstairs. Pickup bar is down the street." "Seriously, Mr. Jeffries?" "American fascist movements, Sims?" Trish was startled by the rude tone of the reply. Dr. Sims was not smiling, and he looked for some seconds at the student. He didn't seem amused by Jeffries. Jeffries looked back at him. Was that insolence? "Thank you, Mr. Jeffries." Sims's voice was harder, quieter, Trish thought. He went on with the class list then, perhaps having measured Jeffries or tired of him. Most of the discussion was about the nature of history doctorates, their uses and limitations. Several of the students appeared to be considering other programs, and the level of work necessary to finish successfully. Jeffries spoke up almost as if his participation was a gift to everyone. "I planned on reading the major historians and what they wrote on the Klan and the German-American Bund. My idea was to conduct a meta-synthesis of the best historians and critics." Meta-synthesis. Trish looked at Jeffries, wondering if he were serious. Dr. Sims waited a moment, perhaps wondering who the major historians might be. "Do you mean only Bund? Not the American Nazi Party founded by Rockwell later? There have been several other significant fascist groups and movements. The Black Legion, Business Plot, Silver Legion, Coughlin's Followers. Recent groups that might be fascist like White Aryan Resistance, or left-wing groups that have similar structures. You need to show there is a lack of knowledge or study of your topic, as well as your plan to investigate it before it will be approved. You need to identify a change or idea, perhaps an event, that has not been adequately investigated. Jeffrey seemed flustered, never having considered that Sims might expect more than that he read popular histories of American Nazis. Trish thought she saw amusement in Sims's eyes, quickly veiled. She thought Jeffries had picked a subject out of thin air because he thought it would be easy or impressive to someone, and hadn't considered he was expected to defend his project every step of the way. Perhaps he was surprised Sims knew more than he about the subject. Racism precludes rigor, Jeffries said. You act as if there is a philosophy of intellectual depth. My thesis is that it is a shallow ideology based in their ignorance and lack of education. Why do you think it's based in lack of education or ignorance? Sims asked. The Nazis? Skinheads? You expect me to read tons and tons of that propaganda as if it's anything other than white supremacist caterwauling? You chose your topic, Sims said. He shook his head. Perhaps you underestimate the depths of intellectual thought among the fascists. It's not my field, but I've seen references to Nietzsche, Schinnerer, Riehl, Heidegger, Savitri Devi, and other writers, Darwin, Plotz, and other scientists. American fascists are not in a bubble. I doubt the topic will be as superficial as you assume. And the meta-analysis of secondary readings is more suited to studies of effective educational techniques than history. We don't study just because we can. Of course, if you approach it another way, your PhD could be a study in intellectual history, but it would have to be carefully approached. I doubt you'll find much enthusiasm for a study of the studies of fascism. We use primary sources and reach our own conclusions. You should see your advisor, Dr. Marshall, I think. I will, Jeffries said, almost disgusted, accusingly. Trish wondered if it were possible for him to be humiliated. Dispassion is not difficult. One just need not care, Sims said. But approaching every subject, every statement, every event, with an open mind, associating with the vast experience of humanity, and treating each historical actor as a full human being. That's what makes an historian different. Historians take great advantage of hindsight. Our subject is the memory of humanity, and there's purpose in that. He stopped and shook his head. It is quite possible for a reporter or general to write a great history of a battle or event. What makes the historian's job important? He finished. We with degrees compete with every participant, every knowledgeable observer, everyone who wants to explain. We bring diligence, hindsight, knowledge, time, years of study, books, consideration of every possibility, and hopefully open-mindedness. He looked directly at Jeffries. I don't believe in perfunctory history. We train people to write the major history, not just summarize it. It requires work and intelligence. It can take, he paused, a lifetime. Jeffries said nothing, and Trish thought that he didn't want to defend laziness. She smiled. She raised her hand. It's a seminar, Miss Finch. You may speak without raising your hand, whenever appropriate. Yes? Of course, forgot, some of what I'm interested in for my eventual dissertation is probably only available in France. How should I handle that? Dr. Sims looked at her with sudden seriousness. History is really going to be your field? And you want to investigate something with many documents in another language and country? Trish answered yes to both. If you're serious, there's only one serious answer, and you already know it. He looked at her, and she realized he was saying she must study French, which she could already speak adequately but not like a native, and she'd have to go to France if that was the only way to get the information. She had taken years of French in her high school and undergraduate years. Perhaps she would add French to her schedule now to improve. It was not daunting to her. It was exciting. She looked at her teacher. He was not smiling, but his eyes were twinkling. Sims saw her excitement at the prospect of language and geographical obstacles and wanted to smile. The room was quiet. He looked at them. You are going to be the experts in your fields, small as you may define them. That PhD means you have made every effort to understand it thoroughly. Not that you understand those who have written about it. That you understand it. Studying history doesn't save anyone's life, Dr. Sims said, but it can reveal its meaning. The room was silent. Perhaps he was trying to discourage the charlatans, Trish thought and smiled. Sims saw her smile, and he wanted to smile also, but didn't. Okay, that's enough for tonight. Don't forget the reading for Thursday. I know it's a lot, but you're worth it. Miss Finch, Mr. Seymour, you are my advisees, so if you'd see me after class for a minute? Okay, see you all Thursday. Trish and Seymour nodded and stayed in their seats as the other 10 filed out. Dr. Sims stood by the door, shaking hands with each student as he or she left. He was an interesting guy, Trish decided. He started off talking to Seymour and arranged a bi-weekly meeting to discuss things. Seymour left then. Miss Finch, you went to Merciful Savior in Skygray? Dr. Sims asked. Yes, graduated 5 years ago. I have a bachelor's and master's from Ohio State, she said. Sims smiled, sitting down across from his advisee. I used to teach at Savior, he said. Right before you got there, probably. I still live in Skygray. I'm commuting from there to here, this semester anyway, Trish said. Your proposal said that you had compelling evidence that a member of the Lost Platoon survived. What is that evidence? Needless to say, the Lost Platoon is fairly famous. The Army officially declared them dead long ago, but the bodies have never turned up. There's quite a bit of interest, even outside the country. I have contacted several of the families, Trish said, and my family is one. From what I can tell, about 2 months after the war ended, some families received a letter, handwritten in pencil. They said the same thing, word for word, except for one, the one my family received. They start with the name of a platoon member, then, your loved one died without suffering and with his fellow soldiers at 5:15 a.m. French local time on June 23, 1918. He is with his platoon, as is fitting. I will not leave any of them. None of the letters was signed. Some of them thought it was a cruel hoax. Others wrote to congressmen, but nothing came of it. She stopped. Sims was quiet and willing to wait. Trish went on. Our family's letter said, I am the lone survivor of my unit. I gave my word. Here, obedient to your word, they lie. Go tell their parents that I will never leave them while I live. I survived June 23, 1918. They did not. No signature. His mother said it was his handwriting. Lieutenant Billy Finch's. My great-great-uncle, I believe. No, one great, not two. Sims let the next pause lengthen and said, It's very moving. You must realize the Simonides association in it. By now he must be long gone. Do you think he stayed with their graves? My great-grandfather said that Billy promised he would not leave a man behind, living or dead. He said he would stay with them, and he thought that's what he did. He wondered if he was crazy or hurt. The army presumed him dead after some time missing in action, with all the rest. You think it's worth a dissertation? Jonas inquired. As part of the larger story, I do. How Skygray handled the loss of so many, so suddenly. The Great War in small-town America. But I'd like to find out what happened, and how. I think a lot of communities face tragedies in the sudden deaths of so many, especially so many of the young. Jonas was quiet and nodding. Start thinking about a larger thesis regarding the impact of the war on Skygray. I know there was a book about the loss of a large number of boys from a Mississippi town in the Civil War. That could give you help, perhaps. I don't know much about the Sullivans in World War II. We'll talk. About the Lost Platoon, I have no contacts with the Army, but I have a friend who's a Marine general now, though a lawyer. He has contacts everywhere, especially in the Pentagon. I'll let him know what you're doing. He might have an idea. Doors open for him. Let me know what obstacles you run into. Trish felt relieved. He seemed to like her project. She'd worried he'd find it laughable. She was on the phone to Ryan as soon as she was out the door. Ryan Armbruster was a year older than Trisha and hoped soon to finish medical school at the University of Cincinnati. He was not tall, not particularly handsome, not rich, not many other things. But he was kind in demeanor, well-read, smart, knew enough baseball to converse with Trisha's dad, and loved her mother's cooking. He was witty in a wry, sly sort of way, and her father sometimes hesitated before laughing uproariously at something he said. Ryan was smart and didn't force it on one. Sometimes an hour might pass after he said something, and someone contemplating would realize that was really smart. After placidly dating Trish for almost a year of her graduate study with Dr. Sims, he became serious. Looking to his future, He knew he'd be pursuing residencies around the country. He didn't want all his experience to be in Southern Ohio. His grades and recommendations were solid to very good, and he was sure he'd be moving elsewhere. Trish was pretty and calm and pleasant. She liked a ball game or a night watching the moon, equally. She was always reading this history or that memoir. With her PhD project about Sky Gray, she'd been absent more than he'd like, interviewing people, looking for connections in town and county records, trying to find the relatives of this farmer or those soldiers. But history is a malleable study, he thought, and would fit in with any flexibility his career might demand of a young couple. Those soldiers. She was obsessed with finding the relatives of the lost platoon, which to him was of little consequence. So another batch of kids were killed far away long ago. What did it matter now? All their grieving relatives were gone. Their loss, like all human losses, was mitigated by time. Absorbed by history, he thought, Ryan saw loss in his daily work. He'd been lectured and the other medical students had discussed the best ways to maintain sympathetic distance, even in the face of the worst tragedies. It was too late for those dead for 4 generations. He shook his head at her earnestness. He humored her by driving with her to some place the other side of St. Louis, Missouri, to find the distant relative of a sergeant in the lost platoon. That had been a bust. Some old couple that hardly knew what she was talking about and only knew that they'd never met the guy. He died before they were born. And some other older relative had talked about him going missing in World War I. It was just too long ago. His sister, his much younger sister, they had met. She was ancient, but still breathing. She talked of Harvey in his uniform, and Harvey's girlfriend who eventually married somebody and probably died in 1965 with a passel of grown kids. Trish ran around this little town talking to one guy after another and wasting a lot of time looking for Harvey Lancaster's girlfriend's children. History was a tenuous connection, Ryan concluded. His connection with Trish was much more solid. On the long drive, they discussed their plans, and she said she was falling in love with him, that she was beginning to think of him as her husband. She said she didn't make significant decisions without thinking how they might affect him and his career. She said, I'll always talk to you before a big decision now. I want us to work things out so we can be together. She's serious and she understands, Ryan thought. He thought the same way for some time. She should avoid making commitments that might take them apart. He was looking at residencies just as her program was reaching the dissertation, so there was pressure on them both. Logically, he felt they must compromise. His schooling was costing so much, his ultimate reward would be so much the greater, that he knew she'd understand the practicality of his program carrying more weight than studying history. In particular, studying a town a century before. But once she had the degree, she could study history anywhere, so she'd be much more flexible. Flexible, he thought. She was flexible. They'd finally had sex. Not pretend sex, half sex, this sex or that sex. Sex. Let's have fun and do lots of things sex. He smiled, remembering one evening and night. Trish had been grateful he'd put up with the trip and her running around, leaving him alone much of 2 days. Very grateful. He concentrated on sex, and she was different with their mutual declarations of love. She was not just a willing but an enthusiastic lover. She talked during it, the whole thing. Her head was in his lap and then his was in hers. She would talk on about loving it, or don't stop, or keep doing it, or do me this way, and on and on. He slowly slid into her. She was on top and backwards. Then she swung around and raised herself up and down on him. Then she bent over on the bed, and he stood above to screw down into her. She said, I feel all of you in me, and just you in me. He came at that, realizing she was something of a contortionist. She'd not avoided sex because she was a prude. She avoided it until she was sure she loved. She was finally convinced he loved her. She knew what she was doing, she was sure. She'd waited until he expressed strong emotion for her, and until she felt it for him. It slowly dawned on Trish that she loved Ryan. It had seemed a very momentous thing to say she loved him. He wasn't perfect, but he was kind. He was joining a caring profession, and she appreciated his patience. She liked being with him. Her parents remarked on it. A doctor of medicine married to a doctor of history. Or as he saw it, they'd be a real doctor and a liberal arts PhD. He'd be supporting lesser studies by simply marrying her, and it made him feel beneficent. He never put it that way, of course. He didn't want her to feel inferior in their relationship. Ryan was thinking he would like to be married by the time he finished residency, and Trish was pretty, capable, and smart. It's ironic how much time a man can spend with a woman and not notice her fundamental qualities. He knew she was obsessed with that small town, with how people did things 100 years ago, about how they dealt with the loss of 40 boys. He never realized she was getting to know those who were still alive, and through them she thought she knew the dead. He didn't understand why she thought it was important to know people so well. She didn't just want to know, and then know why. She wanted to feel. She wanted to feel what they felt 100 years ago. The good, the loss, the daily life. After the Missouri trip, Ryan and she saw each other less as their programs demanded more time and effort. Trish's last classes were finishing, papers were being written, and dissertation was starting. She had lots to do. Ryan was studying and working at his hospital, not sleeping much but earning praise and positive comment. He and she were together, not exactly living together. She still commuted from Sky Gray for her remnant classes, but most of her work was at the town now, and she could more easily make an appointment with her advisor in town than both of them travel to Cincinnati. But the Cincinnati and University of Cincinnati libraries had local papers she needed, so she was getting to town and could see Ryan then too, if he wasn't caught up at the hospital. She had a key to his room. They had sex. As his program was winding down, she saw the confidence building in him and decided to do something he would not forget. He came in one evening and found her wearing long black gloves, fishnet bodysuit, and on all fours in his living room. "I hope you like what you see and love what you are going to do," she said to him. She didn't turn to look at him. Her bottom was perfect, he thought. "I'm going to screw you," he said. His clothes were off. "First," she said, "you're going to screw me first." He did it then, and she thought she was appreciated. They lay together on the carpet, Trish's head on Ryan's right arm, as she tickled his chest with her finger. She kissed his cheek. "You know," Ryan said, "if you didn't have so many meetings with Sims, we could do this a lot more." "You don't think we do it enough?" she asked. They had sex once or twice a week, but not usually a marathon evening. They were young and in good shape, and sex was fun. She loved him, and he loved her. She said to herself, "I'm getting to the end of my program too," she said. "I need to visit France, to find the lost platoon." He was quiet. "Are you sure? It's not like they won't stay lost. I mean, we see each other so little now as it is." "Oh? What are you getting at?" she asked, suddenly serious. "No, nothing big," he said. "I just don't see the point in hurrying to finish a history program. I mean, it's not like much changes 100 years ago. I need a residency." "Well," Trish said, "you apply around. Give us some options. Just be aware I have to finish my program here. All the papers are here, my sources, or in France. We should do what's best for us and find a way for both of us." Ryan nodded, kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Trish." "I love you too, Ree," she said. Ryan was from Denver. He came to Ohio for medical school. He applied for residencies in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and a few other places, hoping eventually to work in the Rocky Mountain region. His parents and sister were there, and it had so much more to offer than Southwest Ohio. Mountains, national parks, culture, although he'd learned a curt lesson when he'd said that at one of Trish's family gatherings. He knew Denver and the Rockies. Trish knew Southwest Ohio, and his experience was so much deeper, he thought. Ryan was accepted at 2 hospitals, one in Salt Lake City, the other in Billings, Montana, and he quickly accepted the offer in Salt Lake City. It was perfect. Trish could come with him. Maybe they would marry over that time. She could find time to get back to Ohio when she must, or finally to France. He couldn't wait to tell Trish. He carefully prepared a romantic dinner to tell her of the Salt Lake City offer and his acceptance, but she surprised him. "I've gotten 2 residency offers," he said. They were eating lasagna that he'd worked on for hours. Candles. Wine. Trish could see the effort. She wondered if he were ready to propose. "Oh?" she asked. "Where?" "Salt Lake City and Billings, Montana," he said. "I'll start this summer in Salt Lake City. I think you'll be able to finish here without too much delay." He was proud. She could see, and he wanted her to be happy. She looked at him. "We could get married, find a place there, and you could come back." It might only put you back a semester. You already accepted? She said. You only applied out west? Yeah. I had the two offers, quickly, and I decided this was the better for us. Trish was silent. She'd thought he might ask her to marry him, but instead he'd given her a fait accompli. She spoke French fairly well now. Apparently her trip to France would not be a honeymoon. She finished the meal. She said no to dessert. He wondered why she was suddenly cool. What had gone wrong? Finally, she looked him squarely in the eye. Ryan, I made a mistake. I understand you have a wonderful opportunity. You were wise to take it, but I am disappointed. I would not have taken a position in Tampa or Cleveland or anywhere without asking you if you thought we could still be happy or survive as a couple. You assumed I would turn my back on my life here, my plans, and much of my work. I understand you think your work is the more important. I don't mind working things out with you, but it had to be with you. I will not take a back seat in my marriage. Thank you for so much. I wish things were different. He saw tears sliding out and down. I loved that guy who waited patiently for me in Missouri. I could have loved him. Saying that, she looked at him. She realized that he had no idea what had gone wrong. She smiled sadly. She understood the lost platoon families better than he understood her. For the first time, Ryan, I think my profession is more important than yours. She remembered what Dr. Sims had said at that first seminar and realized she believed him. Trish came to know Dr. Sims very well, but she came to call his wife her friend despite their age difference. Emily arranged a flight for Trish to Washington, D.C. to visit some archives of World War I, saving Trish a hassle and some money. Emily said, "If I can arrange it, Kansas City has a marvelous World War I museum." Trish jumped on the proposal. The museum was renowned. Emily flew her to Kansas City, and she spent 2 days at the museum and talking with one of its historians, who knew Dr. Sims. It was a marvelous experience. The site was beyond good. She learned about unit historians from him. Jonas smiled when Trish knocked on his office door. "You know you can always come right in, Miss Finch," he said, motioning to a chair. "I hate to do that," she said, sitting down. "So, are you ready for your trip?" It was almost 2 years since she'd started her PhD program. "I think so. Emily's planning to fly me to New York, and from there I'm off for Paris. I have appointments with..." But she interrupted herself. "General Marks gets things done, doesn't he? I mean, people do things when he shows an interest or has a request," she said. Jonas Sims was smiling. "Indeed. I told you that doors open for him. He called me," she said, "after I told you I was having trouble finding the army records from that time. You know, written orders, maps from the day they disappeared. Stuff that's sometimes in a file someplace. I told him what I needed. He said, 'Let me look into it.'" Trish was shaking her head, and Sims had an expression as if he knew what was coming. "And?" Jonas asked. 2 days later, I got a call from some civilian historian who had the file for the lost platoon's activities in France. He said they'd been misplaced probably since the war, and a reorganization 30 years ago made it harder to find them. He was apologizing. Anyway, he faxed the contents to the office here at school. But that's not all. The next day, I got a call from a German army historian, and he said he was searching for information. 4 days later, he sent me an essay in English explaining about the German withdrawal near Rochambeau, the morning of the lost platoon's attack. I now have maps in English with all sorts of military markings, maps in German with all sorts of markings and translations, and you're pleasantly exasperated, I guess. Pretty typical Tom Marks stuff. I don't understand it, I can't pay for it, and nobody even asked for a cent, she said. And can you take some time and explain a lot of what I'm seeing? I'll bring it all by tomorrow or whenever you're free, she said. Sims laughed. Come by the house. Emily will be home tomorrow night. I'll be there, Trish said as she left. She spent the evening gathering papers, writing down questions, and wondering who Tom Marks really was. Wow, just wow, Sims said upon seeing everything. So began her crash course in understanding military maps. She and Sims huddled for days and evenings, locating places and figuring GPS coordinates by associations of old maps and Google Maps with an area northeast of Paris near a little town. For some reason, this company commander's map had marks in pencil on vulnerable paper. Regardless, and Trish now had the faxed copies. There was also a hand-drawn map of the platoon's position on a finger, with a swamp and trenches and certain landmarks included. A note in the corner said, Morrow Farm, June 15, 1918. Was it Uncle Billy's drawing? She wondered. She had faxes of orders to the company commander and several other papers. They pored over the papers. After days, Trish and Dr. Sims identified the likely position of the platoon on modern topographic maps, as well as the farm owners. There were false leads. Other searchers had identified the platoon's location on a farm north of Rochambeau, the Morneau Farm. Jonas Sims was convinced they were in error based on the family name, similar topography, and not actual maps from the period. Trish was prepared to investigate both locations, although much of the Morneau farm was now a housing development. Despite their close work, Trish worried about her relationship with her advisor. Dr. Sims called other candidates by their first names, some of whom he barely knew, but for some reason not Trish. She wondered why that was until she spoke with Emily at a backyard gathering he held every spring and fall for his students. Emily planned to fly Trish to New York in just a few days. Trish was helping Emily set up for the gathering. Why does Dr. Sims call the other candidates by their first names, but not me? I think we know each other better than any of the others, but he's never used it. Emily was mixing a bowl of salad and stopped to smile at her. She looked directly at Trish. Because he likes you, she said. Trish was surprised. Emily smiled and explained, he doesn't call you by your first name because you're doing business and he wants to keep the professional distance. With the others that he advises, he doesn't fear he'll become their best buddy or cross a professional line. With you, he feels friendship, but until you get your doctorate, he wants to keep it professional. Emily's eyes were wide and sincere. She knew her husband a lot better than Trish had known Ryan. It's not a crush. He did the same thing with a guy a few years ago. The one he just wrote a review of his book, she said. Trish said, oh, I thought he was just formal with women. Well, he notices women, but he's pretty consistently professional. With you, he wants to be sure you see him as your advisor, not a guy hitting on you or anything. Emily finished with the salad and pulled some vegetables out of the oven. I'm ready to go to Europe, Trish said. I'm kind of scared to look for the lost platoon. What if I find nothing after all this? Your dissertation's almost ready? Emily asked. Yeah, except for the last draft and resolution of the platoon situation. It's a hole in the story. I've interviewed people of 3 generations. It was quite a crisis in 1919. A lot of people were just devastated around here, she said. They had no closure. Some wrote their congressmen, senators, President Wilson. Emily shook her head. I hope you find them. It's not very likely, is it? Trish shook hers. I'm going to the last known position. Look around there. The Germans say there's no record of an infantry attack on that date at that location, nor of taking time to bury a bunch of Americans. The Germans were pulling back that day. There was a big artillery bombardment to protect their withdrawal. There's a swamp right there, so maybe they went into that and were machine-gunned or something. Who knows? She seemed resigned to failure, if it should happen. You have a plan for being over there? Emily asked, knowing there was no way her husband would let Trish go to Europe without an itinerary. I have appointments with the mayor of the town, a nearby museum director, some old guys in a nursing home, and I think the local priest. Also some guy who wrote a book on World War I in that area. I read the book. He hardly mentioned the lost platoon except to say its final location was in question. But I'll be busy. I also have some days to wander the woods, if I can find where the platoon was. I hope it's worth your while, Emily said. I'll see what the locals think. Hopefully it will be the denouement. Emily smiled. Practicing your French again. Huh? Sims insisted on knowing everything about her trip, since she'd be flying alone. She promised to keep him updated. He was nervous about the trip and didn't want her to notice. She was nervous, too. She met with him at his house the night before she left. He said, I may, contact you to check on things. I don't want you feeling abandoned. Sometimes history is a lonely subject, alone in the stacks, or climbing over hills and through cemeteries. Trish smiled at that and saw Emily nodding, as if to say, told you so. Emily flew Trish to LaGuardia privately, even letting her sit in the co-pilot seat for the flight. Trish found it exciting to sit on the right as the plane landed. Be sure to keep Jonas aware of everything, Emily said. I will, Trish promised, as she lugged her bag to find the Air France terminal. It was the longest flight of her life, from LaGuardia to Paris. She had time to think, read, and wish things were different. Originally, she hoped Ryan would accompany her. She missed him, several months now. The inn was run by an old woman who introduced herself in English as Audrey, just Audrey, and proceeded to the routines of the inn. Breakfast at 7, not after 7:30, room cleanings, run of the house. It was at breakfast that they talked. But for her, the inn was empty. "Why are you here, mademoiselle?" she asked Trish, perhaps to test her French. Rochambeau is not a tourist attraction. Emily enjoyed using her French. "I'm studying history. Something happened near here, to some American soldiers in World War I. I was hoping to find out what happened to them." Audrey was nodding. She was perhaps 65, certainly not close to the World War I generation of 100 years ago now, but old enough she may have spoken with them before they all passed. "So much has happened since then," Audrey said, sadly. "We have. The Germans took all of. The First War is now almost forgotten around here. We were occupied in the Second. We had Jews, they are all gone now. We lost all our boys to work in German factories, a generation. We had collaboration, resistance, Maki. The Second War haunts us. If you were here for that, there would be trouble. Feelings are still very hard between families of the resistance and those of the collaborators. Some are both." Trish saw the emotion at lost lives, tragedy in lives changed by evil before Audrey was even born. Many had remarked on the relationship of the First to the Second World War. Here, the lines were probably even more indistinct. There is, to the east, a place where there were trenches from the First War. The trenches are mostly gone, but some on the Moreau farm remain, or did when I was a child. We would run along them, but they were eroded and overgrown. I think that might be the place to start. Or maybe you'll see how hopeless it is." Trish nodded, as if admitting she was close to defeat, but really more determined. "Thank you so much. I plan to visit the Moreau farm. The old man still lives. He is perhaps 99? Not of the generation you seek. But they are all gone," Audrey said. "He would have known them." "Is he lucid? Capable of remembering?" asked Trish. Audrey laughed. "Capable? He will tell you everything and more. But he will answer the question in his head, perhaps not exactly the one you asked. And be careful. He pinches. It's out the dirt road to the east, on the north side of town, not the paved one on the south side of the village. That one turns south." "I will. I have an appointment with your mayor, Monsieur Godot, in a few minutes. Tomorrow, I think I will go to the Moreau farm." The Moreau farm might be the site she wanted anyway. The last known position of the lost platoon was east a few clicks, as Dr. Sims said. Trish was pleased. Audrey saw her hope. "Just don't touch anything you don't understand. Bombs still come up from the ground every year, especially on that farm. From the first." She walked to the mayor's office, because she didn't have the money to rent a car. She wore loose pants, a light shirt, a jacket, light hiking boots, a ball cap. It was June and would be warm. Perhaps the Moreau farm was their last location. It was east of the town, and about the right distance, according to Audrey. She had copies of the orders to the platoon's company commander, the description of their last known position, the unit diary for the days before and after their disappearance, a report from a captain sent to investigate the unit's disappearance, and an old map with the platoon's location and the plan of attack for that morning, June 23, 1918. The pencil on the attack map was very faded, but Trish had it digitally enhanced, at some expense. Rochambeau was just 2.5 kilometers west. There was a trail or road marked nearby, communications trenches, and the platoon's front line trench marked. She had the GPS coordinates entered into her phone. Monsieur Godot was older than Audrey, tall and thin. "The First World War?" the old guy asked. "Yes, Moreau farm." He mumbled something that Trish did not understand. "Pardon?" she asked. "I didn't hear what you said." "There is the ridge there. Some trench. No good for farming, overgrown with weed and scrub trees now. They said since the First War. Do you know any more about it?" Trish asked, but the man shook his head no. "We played there, army and cowboys and Indians, growing up in the de Gaulle years. We called it Crete Fall." Trish didn't understand at first, but then fall came to her. "Fool. Madman. Madman Ridge. He directed her to the Moreau farm, said the road was bad and might destroy her car. I will walk then, she said. That first evening in Rochambeau, Dr. Sims called her. She was no longer surprised. I intend to visit the Moreau farm east of town tomorrow, she said. Good luck, Miss Finch. Let me know what you find, if anything. And please, be careful. By the time she reached Moreau farm, Trish was perspiring. The day was hot in the sun, and the exertion made her thankful for the 2 water bottles she'd filled at the inn. There was a brick pylon where a dirt driveway intersected the road from the left. Trees lined the drive, but thinly, and crops were growing to left and right. At the end of the drive was a small farmhouse of white stucco, a barn, and a covered bin for silage. She guessed, beyond were more fields, but to the northeast the ground rose rather distinctly. It was not terribly high, but it overlooked all of this land and would afford a good view were it not for the trees. The trees were not large. Perhaps the soil was rocky, thin, or poor. The trees clung to a measly life. She checked her copies of the maps while sitting under a tree beside the drive, checked her GPS. Dr. Sims had taught her about contour lines and fingers and ridges and cliffs, and she'd identified saddles and spurs around Sky Gray and found them on maps in the old military maps of this area. She understood all of these things before he'd started with her, but he was right. The ground never looked the way the maps seemed to describe. She understood the difference between contour lines and contours. Before her was a ridge, actually a finger sloping from a hill some mile or so away. She assumed it was the platoon's last known position. It probably was. Trish reached the small house, thankful for the shade of the trees near the house. There was a porch that brought some relief from the sun then. She knocked on the wood screen door. "Ha! You never saw us, ha!" she heard from behind and in French, startling her so she jumped. 2 voices, from little people. She turned to face them, but there was no one there. She looked about. Behind her, she heard a man say, "You must look up." She raised her eyes, and in the tree to the left, she saw a thin arm stretched around the trunk and holding a branch in a small hand. And then a girl's head with a smile peeked around the tree. 9, maybe? She saw movement to the right and noticed a boy, perhaps 11, standing on a larger branch in another tree across the lane, smiling as if to say, "Gotcha." "It's their way of saying welcome," the man said as she turned. He was short, her age and height, with a day's growth of beard and dark hair and eyes. "Hello," Trish said. "I am Trish Finch. I was told that a man lived here, and I was hoping I might talk to him. I live here, and I am a man," he said.
Jacques Moreau.
He studied her closely, unusually. "No, I mean yes, but I was told an older man might tell me about the history of the area. Come in, Miss Finch." "I heard that right," he said, almost as if it meant something to him. "My grandpa is inside in the back room. It is the only one air-conditioned. We have it running constantly in the humidity. It helps him breathe. He must be the one you seek." He held the door for her. "Yes, Finch, thank you." "You are American?" he asked, pointing to a chair in a small living room with a couch, coffee table, 2 chairs, a full case bookshelf, and assorted toys. "Yes. I've never been to France. It's my first chance to speak French outside a classroom or one trip to Quebec years ago." She sat in the one chair. He took the near side of the couch about 3 feet away on the other side of an end table. "Ah, I noticed how slowly you speak, but very well. You must have a talent. May I get you some water? Lemonade?" "Lemonade would be great. Thank you." He left the room, and she heard him in the kitchen. He opened the kitchen door and yelled something to the kids, and she heard the girl answer back something. He came back with lemonade with ice in a tall glass. "So why do you visit us, miss?" He was looking directly at her, sipping his own lemonade, but very serious. "I'm a history student, working on a PhD. I'm studying the impact World War I had on my hometown. Near here, in 1918, was the last known position of an American platoon that never returned home. They died or something. June 23, 1918. It was quite a loss for such a small town as most of them were from. For all of Western Ohio, really. He was quite good-looking, she thought. His eyes were so direct and unwavering. She wondered if she seemed foolish to a man who worked the land, a more practical occupation than studying history. Who comes so far at such expense to find out what happened to some guys 100 years ago? She answered herself, historians do. World War II was devastating to us in Rochambeau. You know, the resentments remain. There were many collaborators here. Many acted out of fear. Some were guerrillas or Maki. One woman, who had her hair shaved in retribution, killed herself and they let her body hang. He said nothing but steadily looked at her. She was quiet, and finally he went on. But here, on this farm, we are famous. She detected an ironic or sarcastic quality to his tone. He continued, we set a record, for years ago. We are still fighting not World War II but World War I. You see, in our fields, we have an old trench from World War I. 3 trenches actually. What's left of them? There was fighting here early and then late in the war. Yes, there were Americans here, but for all these people, the Germans and British and Americans, everyone who was here in that war, it's over. You see? She did see, but not what he was getting at. He seemed angry at the world, and he wanted her angry, too. For Poilus and Tommies and Yanks, it's all over. They were killed or injured or captured, and the survivors, they went home. He was speaking with such emotion. She wanted to say, it was 100 years ago. I didn't mean to upset you, she said, holding the cold, wet glass to her cheek for some relief from the heat, wondering what was so unnerving to him, hoping her simple, common gesture would bring him calm. No, no, he said almost in distress, as if he were having trouble making himself clear. You must understand. At Moreau Farm the war is still being waged. The Great War is not over. He paused, obviously with more to say. There was a passion in him that demanded respect. We have yet to defeat the Boche. You see, the last casualty of World War I was here, on this farm. She spoke up, hoping to calm him if she could. I thought the last action was to the east and north in 1918? No, you don't understand. No, he said, almost incoherently to Trish. The soldiers stopped fighting and went home. Their war was over. The politicians signed a paper. It is over, celebrate. But farm wives, they fight on. For them the war goes on now 100 years. My sister Amy, the children's mother, almost 4 years gone now. He looked angry. She was the last killed in World War I. Of course, Trish knew that bombs were regularly making their way to the surface at all the modern battlefields. The freeze-thaw cycle exposed them. Farmers near a battlefield were cautioned to watch carefully where they plowed, to check for unexploded ordnance of any type. Duds could prove deadly 100 years later. Hand grenades, landmines, artillery shells, bombs dropped from planes. All were deadly threats to generations to follow. Dr. Sims had warned her about poking around unmarked, unchecked, perhaps unremembered battlefields. The European governments even had a highly paid and highly trained unit to recover or dispose of unexploded ordnance whenever found. Jacques left her alone then to check on the children, who a few minutes later followed him into the living room and sat beside him on the couch. Sherry, Jean, this is Miss Finch. She came here all the way from America. The children perhaps had calmed him. Hello, Miss Finch, they mumbled looking down, suddenly shy at the close encounter. Hello, Sherry, Jean. That was quite a fright you gave me outside, Trish said and smiled. They had little smiles now, but said nothing for a few seconds. Then Sherry said something to Jean that Trish could not hear. Trish raised an eyebrow. Jean said, she thinks you sound funny. I'm still learning French. I speak English at home, Trish replied. Oh, they nodded. Could you say something in English? Sherry asked. In English, she said, when I get home, I will tell my parents I met 2 French children named Sherry and Jean. They laughed, probably not understanding. Jacques hushed them and told them to play within sight of the house, and they ran off. I can tell you a lot about what happened here, but my grandfather is the one who knows the most. He even has some papers. Come with me, bring your lemonade. We'll let him stay in his air conditioning, he said, turning and leading the way through a dining room and then a passageway. He knocked, opened a door, and Trish felt the welcome of cool, dry air as she entered a small room with a daybed and a rocking chair. An old man was rocking gently in the chair. Grandpa, Jacques said, this lady has come to visit us from America. From Skygray, Grandpa. She'd not said Skygray, assuming they'd not know it. Jacques recognized her name. The old man looked at her closely then. He had the mottled skin of great age and outside work, but his eyes were not dull. He could see, and Trish thought she saw memory there, intelligence. Her name is Miss Finch, Grandpa. Miss Finch, he said, spelling it for the old man. Silence. Trish stepped forward. I'm Patricia Finch, from Sky Gray, Ohio, and I'm trying to find out what happened to the American platoon that was posted here in June 1918.